Hello everybody and welcome back to You Can't Win. This is Tom here and I'm joined by Don as usual. And we also have guests AgileTablet and Alana, and they're joining us to talk about true crime. I sort of had this idea that women in particular are fascinated with true crime stuff, serial killers and all that kind of good stuff. And I thought it might be kind of fun to talk about that. I personally have been watching some interrogation videos and things like that on YouTube and kind of found it a little bit interesting, so I thought it would be fun to get into it. Alana, in particular, I think is a pretty big fan of this kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe you'll be our resident expert, and we will
God.
pick your brain.
Yeah. So when you're talking about interrogation videos is this on like YouTube or something? Like, where are they sourced from? Like court release or something? Or
yeah, they're like the official, like it's just raw footage. I don't usually watch just like hours long raw footage of it. That's just, not
pretty
super
brutal.
Entertaining and stuff.
The chopped and screwed version is a little better.
Yeah. So like there are people on YouTube that make like edits and some of them have commentary and stuff that they provide, which usually isn't especially interesting in terms of the analysis, but it is just useful in getting like a concise summary of like a story, and they like fast forward through boring stuff.
The one guy that you have been listening to or watching rather lately is he always makes me laugh because he'll pause it and be like, this is known as the Korpunski reaction, and it's just like a guy like looking up or something,
man.
and this indicates a startle reaction, and when the blood enters the brain, it's like, shut up, like I don't know, they're just so funny.
It's funny you mentioned that too, because I guess like the other day. So let me just preface this. I was talking a little to you guys about it, but. So the main true crime podcast I listened to, and this is going back years at this point, so back then it was much cooler. Probably not. But anyway, I'm a big Sword and Scale fan. And if you have any familiarity with that podcast, it's pretty evident, even just from listening. But there's whole Reddits, subreddits devoted to it too, about how big of a piece of shit the host is. I think it's Mike Boudet. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Boudet, yeah.
Yeah, Boudet, yeah. But if you can like bracket that part of it, it's actually pretty enjoyable. But anyway, the other day I was listening to one, or maybe like a week ago. He was saying something so off-putting to me that I was thinking about why I must like this. Like, how do I square that circle, I guess? And anyway, that like led me down the thought of what is he actually doing, right? Like, why is this more fascinating to me than another podcast? And it's because he's a good storyteller.
Yeah.
And like when you mentioned cutting up and kind of getting the meat of like an interrogation or something, there's little to no analysis, which is kind of what I like more.
Yeah.
Like when you mentioned like the shitty, like obviously that guy is doing something else, but like the analysis is less interesting to me than the story. So I tend to like veer more towards podcasts or shows where it's just very factual and it's following a certain narrative. And but as far as like the analysis side of it, I don't really want to hear that. Like some guy.
Yeah, and his analysis is usually quite obnoxious. I really don't like, and the thing that I liked about it is very similar to what you were saying. He usually only like in the beginning when he's setting up the story, and at the end when he needs to, do like a little conclusion, that's when I am more liable to like just turn it off, because I don't care what he has to say and he annoys me. But the thing that I like about what he does is he uses a ton of raw material. He uses lots of audio of interrogations and newspaper clippings and interviews with people who were central to the story, like after the fact. And I just like that it's a lot of just, like you said, like presented without commentary. I like that,
Yeah. There was a podcast I was listening to that was sort of similar. It was about the Johnny Gosch case, like the Franklin scandal thing.
Oh, yeah.
That was interesting because there is a lot of unreliable sort of like evidence around that. So it's interesting to kind of like she presents what we have on it, and then digs into like, okay, well, this is what we know about the person, and this is where things get a little bit, into a gray area about like how verifiable is this information and that kind of thing. So I find that interesting, and I think it's also the stories for me that's interesting to dig into that. I'm not really sure what the kernel is, like what's so fascinating about these kinds of things. I think that maybe part of it is that you can kind of see it as like a real, like it happens in a situation or in a context where you can really relate to it. Like it's generally some sort of thing that you can kind of understand. Like if it starts off, let's say it's like some married couple and the husband kills the wife or something like that. It sets it up as like this couple, they had this, relationship, they got married. You can instantly relate to that. They're real people. You can kind of immediately pick up on like what's going on there. And then it just takes this left turn, which seems so far from like the reality that, most people live. So,
but sometimes there's an element of like, exploitation genre too, because a lot of times there will be, it isn't necessarily identifiable. It'll be like, this man who owned a pig farm was attacking indigenous prostitutes or something like that. Like that's totally outside of and that is a real guy, by the way. It's not something that I relate to in my life experience at all. So where does that come from? Is it coming from a different place or the same place? I don't really know. I don't have an answer to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. There was one I was watching recently that was about, I forget where it was. It was Louisiana, I think. It was like this 15-year-old was killed and beaten to death with a baseball bat pretty brutally. And a friend of that kid confessed to it, but so did the father of that kid. So the father of the kid who confessed. So they both confessed to it, saying that the other did not do it. And it kind of went back and forth, and it was like really bizarre. They both like recanted their confessions and then said, no, I actually did do it. And they kept kind of going back and forth. And it turned out that like the father said that he did it so that he would be in jail instead of his son. And then his son ended up being like this meth head, like loser anyways, who was constantly in jail for other reasons. So it ended up like not being for nothing. And that's why he kept like recanting on it. It's like, well, I said I did it because of, I was trying to keep my son out of jail, and then he's in jail anyways. So, so like that's a situation that I can't relate to really at all. And that was, I don't know, I guess it's just interesting to kind of try to figure out what the psychology is going on there. Like what are the people thinking? What are their different motivations? So maybe that's a big part of the fascination.
Yeah, I think whether or not someone as a certain type of criminal is identifiable or not, there is that quest to connect with them on some level, or to highlight the disconnection and be like, what the hell? How could this person even exist? And that kind of stuff,
Yeah. There's two that come to mind here that are pretty different from anything I can relate to. So there's one which is known as the Facebook killer. I think that got pretty famous. This guy was like an amateur boxer with an undefeated record, and he kind of fancied himself like kind of this jack of all trades, sort of a Renaissance man. Like he was writing these bizarre self-help books, self-publishing them, and thought of himself as like this entrepreneur, like success win sort of a guy. And he ended up killing his wife at some point, and then like they had an argument or something like that, and posted it on Facebook, like took a picture of her body and put it on Facebook, and he ended up like defending himself in court, of course, because he has the confidence to do that.
Sounds like the type.
Yep. And his defense of like posting on Facebook was like that he wanted to just tell the family, like that was his way of, he didn't want to hide from it. Like it was sort of like an honorable thing in his mind. And he was clearly kind of crazy. Once he was in prison for a while, he just went completely nuts. And yeah, like I remember one thing they showed in the video was, so he eventually did hire another lawyer, like a lawyer to represent him. And he was saying all kinds of bizarre stuff. And the lawyer was like, his personality and mental state is not on trial here. We're trying to look at the case. Like, let's leave aside what he says, all that kind of stuff. So that was pretty funny.
Reminds me, actually, the most recent, this is going back a lot of episodes, but the most recent Sword and Scale episode I listened to was about, there was, I guess, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story. I didn't know it before I had heard it on the show, but there was a guy who obviously very mentally unwell, and as they say, like, something snapped, that one day. He's on a Greyhound.
Oh God.
But yeah, right.
I know this story.
Yeah. And ends up, I guess they take like a smoke break somewhere, has some kind of very polite, innocuous interaction with another guy on the bus. Like, I think he's smoking a cigarette, and like he gives him a nod or something. And for whatever reason, like, once they're back on the bus, he basically just like hacks this guy up on this crowded bus. Ends up like, and I mean, like, it's gory and dark in a way that I don't think a lot of like the murders they focus on are, because this guy was like eating parts of his body in front of people, like playing with like, I don't remember the specific details, but he ate an eyeball of the guy, like, really, and he did it with a very intimate weapon too. So it's not like, you're shooting someone a kind of a level
few hundred
removed,
feet away.
From the actual intimacy of the crime. So it was especially like unsettling.
Was that in Canada, or was that the bus? Okay.
Yes, that was a Canada one. But the way that podcast episode went, he ended up walking free. And I'm not really sure
I remember
how that happened.
He was schizophrenic, and he was either not, he had never had any sort of episode like that any other time in his life. Like, I think he was like in his 40s or something. So it's not like he was just on the cusp where these symptoms were starting to show themselves.
Where you can sort of, you see the through line.
He had never had any sort of extreme violence in his behavior, whether or not he was medicated, I think. I want to say it may not have even been known at that point. And he had a break, and this occurred. And afterwards, he didn't seem to, like, it was a very clear distinction between when he was in this state that he committed the crime in versus who he normally is. And it really didn't seem fabricated. It was not the case of
it definitely
his lawyer
didn't.
just trying to, finagle a deal for him or something. It seemed very sincerely distinct. And he was very upset by what he had done. I don't think he had any conscious, like, if he had memory of it, it was,
I don't think he did. I think that was one of the things, like, he didn't remember doing it, and then when he found out, he was
aghast.
And I mean, as a relatively sane person, I can't imagine something that horrific happening and your psyche just not splintering. Like, that seems totally valid to me and possible. And I mean, that happens, if you're to believe it, like, quite often in these like extremely violent crimes. But anyway, just to your point about the mental illness aspect of it, like, that was kind of where the podcast episode went. And they had the mother of the victim on there at both the beginning and the end. And at the beginning, I remember thinking to myself, like, God damn, she is taking this well. She talks about it in a way that's like very factual, not taking it well, but like, I can't even imagine being able to like utter the details of it ever. It's just so like traumatic, obviously. But at the end, she was speaking about the outcome and, how he was basically going to be reintegrated into society as a normal, like, functional, most semi-functional person. And if he were to cross, into the US, say, he has no felony attached to his name.
Right.
He can be free to do that. So they were taught, I mean, the host, again, he hates the mentally ill, like, throughout the entire, show. And that's very evident. But he was talking about it being a failure of the justice system, which I don't know how I feel about that. And I don't necessarily.
What would a success be here?
Well, that's exactly, my point too. I remember Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, his birth mother, famously saying after he was killed in jail, basically like bludgeoned to death, she said, like, you fucking murdered him. He's gone. You bludgeoned him to pieces. Like, what else do you want? It's over. You got what you wanted.
Yeah.
And that always stuck with me, because it's like, what do you want? Like, what is rehabilitation, or what is like paying the, a comparable price for someone's life? Like, I don't know. Obviously nobody knows the answer.
Maybe that's part of why, we're talking about like, what is it about these cases? Maybe because there doesn't seem to be, in a lot of these, there is no earthly justice that we can imagine that would be sufficient. Maybe that's part of it, where like, if you, even if some, it's the kind of thing where someone gets like 8 consecutive life sentences or something like that. Like, clearly that's a gesture. That's nothing functional about their punishment, but it's an indication of
symbolic,
how far they've transgressed.
Yes.
Right. So maybe that's part of the interest at some point, that like, how do you get justice? Some people really, have the urge, like, oh, lock them away. We want them away for their whole life. And others have more of a blood interest, like, they want to see them dead or something like that. But in either of those cases, at a certain point, justice does not seem to be being fulfilled, right?
Yeah.
It's just insufficient. Nothing in this world.
Yeah, but the point being that nothing, like, we can fathom, whether it's, execution, or, like you said, consecutive life sentences, or getting murdered in prison, like, whatever the case, I mean, there's no solution.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's muddied even further when the person, in this case, doesn't remember doing it and kind of retreats back to being a normal person. Like, how do you deal with something like that?
But it's also weird to me that someone would be out for this guy's blood too. Like, the fact that I think the way that it worked with him was that, he had to undergo psychiatric treatment. And I think the idea was that if he stays on his meds, this sort of thing is not going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And then he was released by the state. And that's where the problem comes in, because it's like, well, if no one's keeping track of this guy, might this happen again? But
sure.
Supposing that, he has like a PO who's keeping track of him and making sure that he stays on his meds or something like that, I think someone like Boudet still wants this guy to suffer. It doesn't matter that he's not going to do it again, in this hypothetical. He's not content with the fact that this guy really sincerely was a different person during the act. You know what I mean?
No, and I think that's also, I mean, talking about Mike specifically as the host and what he, like, just, as a fan of his show, admittedly,
right.
Having listened to a lot of it, like, I don't think he understands the capacity for evil in people as much as he may gesture towards it or act like he does. Like, he doesn't understand that that's really not, I mean, it's an aberration, but it's not, just to label someone as a monster. You're kind of obviously
you're collapsing
undermining
meaning.
Yes. So much, like, and that's part of like what appeals to me about the true crime genre in general, is as much as I can understand why anyone likes it, it's like the storytelling aspect. You can see things and start to like feel like you're coming closer to solving the puzzle or the narrative of it. Like, if you start at the beginning, say, you can see, someone kind of deteriorating mentally or acting funny, or you can kind of come to terms with like certain things that happen in their life, whether they lost a job or ruined a marriage or whatever it might be. But like, it's still like, you can only come so close.
Yeah.
So
I wanted to, just one of the things about this this sort of case is that it's interesting because in Canada, one of the big things obviously is that our justice system is a little bit, it's only slightly more sort of lenient on terms of like prison sentences and stuff like that. Like we have, that's part of the case that, like, we have all these, it's a very, very strong belief amongst conservatives in Canada that people get off lightly on everything. And so that's part of it. I like a lot of these stories that I've heard of, like that, the person on the bus and that, and some, Paul Bernardo and things like that, like they're very mythic in Canada. Like people talk about them a lot on the news and stuff because of this idea that like they think people are getting away with something. But about the mental health thing specifically, it's interesting. I like personally in the past I had where I would go, like as an outpatient at a hospital for similar sort of stuff, like, for early psychosis and that. And so a lot of the patients were people that, had maybe had a break in their lives or something, or had some sort of problems. And a lot of them had to be hospitalized and things like that for similar kind of things. And it was interesting because it did have this kind of like tone a lot of the time where they're like, people would say, oh, you see on TV that anyone that has these illnesses or whatever is like a psycho killer and all that kind of stuff, right? But it was interesting because they kind of tried to overdo it in the other direction in a way that didn't really seem plausible to anyone in the room, really, kind of thing. They'd be like, oh, they just, they say all these things that people are violent, but they're not violent. And then you like hear like, code white or whatever they are, like the nurses being attacked every day and stuff. And you're kind of like, well, it's very strange, like this whole, because if you're someone that's like, well, it only happened once, you still probably be like, well, if I'm sitting beside them on the bus,
yeah.
you're
Maybe
like,
specifically a bus, yeah.
Like the fact that it only happened, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that's totally valid too, and that's that's fascinating to me. Not even in the sense of like, okay, well, what is justice, but I mean, again, like to go back on the Jeffrey Dahmer, Joyce, his mother's quote, like, what is it that you want?
Yeah.
And I mean, like, and I don't know. I don't know what the right answer is in a lot of cases, but if you believe in any sort of rehabilitation, then you have to, I mean, at some point you have to trust that people won't just resort to that same kind of violent behavior. And there is a chance at rehabilitation, but
yeah.
I don't know.
I think in the US there's a kind of a problem with like a positive feedback loop, because there's kind of the belief that, like Donald was talking about, with conservative folks generally feeling like, people are getting off too easy, that kind of thing. But since the excoriation of our mental health facilities in the Reagan years in the US, there isn't a robust system in place that can help people who their mental illness might manifest in a way that could harm others.
Sure.
There isn't something there that could help them. So then, of course, then people, have a little bit more of a leg to stand on when they say, well, rehabilitation doesn't work. Well, yeah, because there is no fucking rehabilitation anymore. There's nothing that helps these people,
Yeah, there's a system that functions as
so then there's like a positive feedback loop that's like, well, we got to throw them in jail. We got to kill them. We got to do, and it's like, well, did we even really try the rehabilitation portion of that,
Yeah.
I don't know. It makes me sad.
I think that's Tom and I have talked about this before with like the whole issue about rehabilitation and how you kind of maybe want to make it like sometimes the argument too easy, where you're like, well, if we had rehabilitation, then we wouldn't have any crime at all, or if we did it well enough. If we did it well enough, then people just need the social supports and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And I think that for like real rehabilitation, that you kind of have to have that buffer of trust where you're like, okay, well, sometimes things are going to go terribly wrong here, but that we need to kind of keep with the program here, because otherwise we're going to get into the situation where
barbarism.
Barbarism.
Or barbarism, not barbary. Pirates.
Yeah, because I don't really have that. I mean, I guess it's because maybe no serious crimes ever being committed against me or something, but like I don't have that like vengeance urge, so it's strange to me to learn about it in other people. Like it doesn't, like the idea of wanting someone to go to jail just because they did a crime and not because of some maybe social goal, like you need to get them help or something. It doesn't like it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, where did that come from? So
especially with people who haven't had anything terrible happen to them, where is that coming from?
Yeah. That's something I think a lot about too, because I was raised Quaker. So as far as like, believing in justice and believing in the inherent goodness of people, I mean, on paper, I'd love to say like one thing, which is that I believe that everybody there's no such evil that exists in people where they're just malicious for the sake of malice. Like, I mean, say what you will about that, but I don't know that I'd react like a good Quaker if somebody murdered someone close to me. Like, I can't imagine doing so, honestly. But like, it's still a commitment to that belief that, people can be rehabilitated and live productive, lives and lives of meaning. But I don't know. Personally, I think I'd go fucking nuts. Like, just knowing myself. Like, but I do adhere to the belief that people, on paper, again, can be better.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like both of you were saying that there has to be some sort of commitment to rehabilitation even when it fails, because otherwise you're just shutting the door on all of it, right? Like if you are just out for vengeance, then you are cutting off all the cases where someone can be redeemed and can come back. And I think that, even if personally I might not react that way if something terrible happened to a family member, seeing the cases where someone who has done something terrible, like committed murder, have been touched by people like Quakers who have reached out to them while they're in prison or something like that, and have actually sincerely like repented and changed. I mean, seeing that is beautiful, right? I mean, I know it's like a tugging at the heartstrings kind of thing, but it is really inspiring to see that can actually happen, and I don't want that to be gone.
No, for sure. And I mean, that, you hear about it a lot, but because you honestly probably hear about it a lot because it's so infrequent, but the parents or the family members of murderers actually getting involved in the case and the defense of the person who, the perpetrator of whatever crime it might have been. And, there's a correspondence while they're in prison, or they, become the closest people to these murderers or whatever, they are. It does happen, and it's amazing. And I don't know that I would be able to do that, but I would hope. And also, like, another aspect of it, not to get too far off track here, but I mean, at a certain point it's happened, right? And you have to move on as a person yourself, whether you're a parent or a friend or whatever. So what does your life look like after that? You have to decide. And I think that has, that's a lot of the logic behind trying to make something good of a tragedy. Starting a correspondence or a relationship with the person who committed a violent crime, and, trying to see something good come out of it, whatever that might look like.
Yeah. This is funny. I expected, when we said that we were going to talk about true crime, I was like, we're going to talk about all these wackos and their kooky cases, and, and now we're like talking about the nature of justice and human heart and stuff.
There's so much to say about all of it.
It's
you can
true.
really go in a million different directions.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I had mentioned when we were, setting up for this that I wanted to touch on, just because it fascinates me personally, is just like the murderabilia side that comes along with a lot of these podcasts. Podcasts especially, I think, because, I mean, it almost becomes like a kitschy, like Etsy type genre, right? Where like you start to like, I mean, you listen to these podcasts and you get really into like true crime as, quote unquote true crime, and then you become like a fan almost. And something that I think about a lot is like, what's an appropriate level of that? And who's to say what's appropriate? And is it inappropriate, if ever, to, if they're alive, say, like, correspond with these criminals? Is it inappropriate to buy their art? Is it inappropriate to wear their face on a shirt? Like, and what elements decide that? Like, because
I think just by taste, probably it's inappropriate to wear a murderer's face on your shirt.
That's like an interesting point to me, because
sure, no, you're right.
I have just, like, because I like this stupid bullshit, like a bunch of stickers on my laptop that I'm looking at right now of like Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy and Ted Bundy, and but I don't think that's a tasteful display. But I also don't think like it's necessarily like I don't know. I don't think I'm doing anything that horrible. This is stuff that fascinates me for whatever reason. But I always wonder if I would feel differently if they were still alive, or if I knew a victim or was tangentially related to the crime in any way. That would be pretty
weird if you had a sticker.
Oh, it would be fucking weird.
Of someone who killed your friend and you're getting his face on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
If it is, why is that any weirder than me doing it now? Because that's relatively commonplace, at least with the proliferation of true crime as a genre, podcasts, movies, docuseries, whatever it might look like. Merch for serial killers exists.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not uncommon to see people with, Dahmer fucking beaded jewelry. And that was sort of what got me thinking about this in the first place was, a lot of it's so closely related to women and Twitter and the whole true crime podcast stuff. And they're like, oh, I'm dark. I love murders. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But that's become huge, and it makes you wonder why. And it also makes me wonder, is there an appropriate, harmless, if not just tasteless way of engaging with that kind of thing?
Well, I don't understand it really at all. So what do you get out of having those stickers on your laptop, for example? What is it?
I don't. I'll be honest. I don't fucking know. Honestly, it's interesting to think about, and I could tell you why, but I don't know better than anyone.
Is it a funny thing, or is it
maybe a little? For me, it's an interest of mine, like anything else, right? So it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and reading about and watching, and I guess the closest I can come is just a marker of my interests,
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily think that's an interesting or adequate explanation of why, but that's also you can say the same for much of anything that people do or don't like. This gets into Funko Pop territory for me. I don't fucking get it, but go with God.
Exactly.
But that's why it's so interesting to me, is because I don't know. I don't know the answer to a lot of this.
Do you think there's any element of a hero worship sort of a thing going on? Obviously people generally who have this sort of stuff aren't worshiping their heroes away like a sports fan, has a poster of their favorite player up. It's not that exact kind of thing, but there's some, I don't know. I wonder if there's something sort of to it where it's this person is so free. They just did what they wanted to, or something on that level.
I don't know. And it's something that, like I said, I don't know if my response is necessarily going to be that fascinating, because the bottom line is I don't know the answer. But I do think I don't know. I think that, well, specifically for me, I was always very interested in Dahmer, because I feel with Dahmer, there was an element of self-awareness, but also confusion that he was very open about. So there's a lot of raw material also with Dahmer, where you were talking about interrogations and documentaries, and he was alive to talk about a lot of this, and he was very open about it, and so were his parents. So for me, it's always been kind of a fascination with how they dealt with, their impulses and their crimes. And that was more interesting to me than, I guess, just the crime itself. And also, when I first started engaging with true crime, I was much younger, but I was always interested in specifically psychology and law as it relates to crime. So I remember, I don't know, 5th or 6th grade, asking for one Christmas, I was asked to make a Christmas list, and I had a bunch of books that I had found. And I got my number one on my list, which I still have and cherish, was a book called Sexual Homicide. And it was, so first of all, my parents bought this for me as a child.
Yeah.
But it was an actual, I totally skipped the, sexier novels that people would write about these awful crimes, just the mass market paperback stuff. And I went, this book specifically was an actual inventory for FBI profilers.
Oh, wow.
And it was a lot of very small case studies, and it was a tool essentially.
Yeah.
For people
a diagnostic to criminal criminal
absolutely.
psychology?
Yep.
Okay.
And I think the way that I stumbled upon it was I was very interested in Robert Ressler.
I don't think I know who that is.
He was a very like old school FBI guy who basically what's that show, Mindhunter?
Yeah.
I think it's basically like, I don't know if it's based on him or if it's just taking, inspiration from that whole thing, but like he developed the idea of profiling serial killers and engaging with them to actually learn about like, how do you identify one before it's too late?
Right.
So I was, interested in him and a lot that he had written a lot of, books about that. And eventually I guess I stumbled upon like, like I said, it was like an inventory almost about how to understand, it touched upon things like bedwetting and, mutilating animals and behaviors that you can kind of identify in children that you should probably worry about. But it was so fascinating to me because it was an effort better than I had seen before to understand these people in a way that like a lot of true crime today doesn't, right? So like we talked about podcasts being, especially podcasts that focus on the storytelling and like the narrative of a crime, and don't really get into the analysis. Like I like the analysis side when it's done by the right person, I guess.
True.
Yeah.
True.
I kind of gravitate towards that, but anyway.
What do you think of these sort of like turn? I guess I'm not sure if it's a recent turn, but I've seen a lot of debate about it in sort of like the Netflix series and all these series where it seems almost like an anti-romance or something, right? Like it's like they're trying to focus on them murderers as being like seductive, or and it seems almost like. Like it's bound up with sexuality, at least. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of like people are watching them for this. You said you kind of avoided that like the novelizations and all that kind of stuff when you were younger. But is that, do you see that as like a problem with that or is that just kind of it's part of the whole parcel?
Again, I'm like a shitty guest because I don't fucking know the answer to any of this, but not that anyone does, but I tend to avoid, like, there was famously that one with, what's his face, playing Ted Bundy. Zac Efron recently.
Oh,
really?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, on Netflix. And that was huge. And I saw both sides of it kind of hash out on Twitter where, you have like the true crime fans who are very into it and thought it was like, a fascinating way to tell a story that people may not know. And then there was the other side of that, which is fucking like shirtless Zac Efron playing Ted Bundy. And, like, fuck, what are you doing? Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was drawing on the same things that actually happened when Ted Bundy was like around and murdering, is that he was like this seductive guy. Yeah. And I mean, even during his trial, I think he represented himself.
He did in Florida.
Yeah, at least for some of it. And, very charismatic and smart and attractive. And women, they were like head over heels about this, horrible murderer. And I mean, that's a problem that you can see like semi-frequently. I mean, there's women who reach out to these men in jail and start relationships with them. And even like Charles Manson, he ended up getting married. Just to your point about like the sexuality and like the seductive part of it, like, I mean, that's been evident since this was a thing, right?
Yeah, that kind of, I can see this in myself. Like I remember when I was younger, like young teenager, maybe like 13 years old or something, I was really into this kind of stuff, and I remember having like mentally evaluated certain killers as like I thought Richard Ramirez was a very handsome guy, but his killing style was just chaotic, and it was not sexy at all.
Yeah.
And
He's
I
not
was more
calculating
interested.
enough.
Exactly. And I needed someone who would decapitate someone and take care of the head later or something.
Yeah.
Now there we go. That's getting sexier. What the hell? And the thing is that
but that's what I mean. A lot of the response to this, when I think about it, is like, what the fuck is fucked up with my head?
Yeah.
Well,
I don't know.
The thing that I try to be more aware of now is that that's already in the culture somewhere. Like I wasn't born being fascinated with serial killers? Why was I, as a 13-year-old, evaluating the sexiness of them? I don't think that that's something that is, I don't think you can blame
like
a kid.
organic.
Yeah. I don't think you can blame the kid for doing it, for feeling that way. They're picking up something that's being put down somewhere, like that's, I feel like that's kind of true. Like, as a kid, sorry if this is TMI, but I remember when I was in second grade, I would get on the phone with my friend and we would make up what I now recognize as like BDSM stories. Like, what the hell? Like, what?
Yeah. Oh, I can one up that.
How did we come up with that? Like, and I had never, I don't think she had either, but I don't think either of us had ever been exposed to like pornography of that nature or anything like that, or pornography at all. And it's already there. Like, there are elements even in like fairy tales that play on these sorts of things that you get acculturated into. So at the same time, like, that, I ask myself, like, why am I interested in this? I'm not going to totally blame myself. I would blame myself if I indulged it too much, because now I recognize it as something that is harmful, that should not be enhanced in my personality. But I don't blame people for being interested in it in the first place, because we're just attuned to something that's already there in the culture.
Well,
I have something dynamics that are there.
I can one up you as far as embarrassing TMI children's stories go.
Here we go.
So some people may have seen this on Twitter. I really hope it never makes the rounds again, just for my sake. But just to the point of like this being specifically attractive because it's scandalizing and dark and like, I don't know, like off-putting, but it's like titillating, right?
Yeah.
So fucking Jesus Christ. When Molly and I were real young, I'm talking like second grade, we would put pillowcases over our heads and pretend to be the KKK to each other, because it was so evil to us. The idea was so evil that we were like enamored with the idea that people could do something so terrible. And it was like our way of working out, like, okay, this happened. And like, it was so scandalizing, but like exciting for a child to think that people have the capacity for that. Like, I don't know what the reason was there. Like, we were also just two fucking freaks, but like, it was also a way of kind of like, I don't know, like coming close to understanding that, like as two idiot second grade children can with fucking pillowcases. But like it's like an attempt at grappling with something that's really dark and kind of incomprehensible.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I think that maybe is kind of a big motivation behind like any interest in this kind of stuff. I think there's something about that, like the stickers on your computer or just like that kind of thing. I think there's, I was talking about the hero worship before. That's kind of what I was getting at, the idea that like a person can be like that, like can go to that extreme in whatever way. I think there's some kind of interest in that just generally.
I think you might be onto something with that in the school shooter genre of that, which I actually think is kind of fake. I think most of the people who get into that are like doing it because they fancy themselves dark, kind of like Alana was talking about. But like in more recent years, like there's cults of worship of teens getting really into school shooters, and part of the rationale, at least that they profess, is that sort of hero worship, where that it's the maybe it's the idea of like letting go of norms or morality or something, and then they get into that. But I don't think that's the case with all true crime fascination.
No, and I think too, that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about, especially with that semi-recent media pushback when it comes to publicizing these killers.
Yeah.
Don't say his name, don't show his face. That's what they want. You're giving them the fame they so desperately crave. All right, well, you turn on fucking Netflix and you can watch, hours and hours and hours and hours of, if you type in Ted Bundy on Netflix, you're going to get like 15 different things. So, I mean, and I don't necessarily think that that's an awful thing either inherently, but I mean, it's just a weird, like, what is the proper way to engage when something horrible happens? Like, are you supposed to, and does that change if they're dead versus alive? And, there's other elements that I think about a lot. But yeah, I mean, even look at like the Columbine thing, that, Tumblr people like getting weird about that and doing like fucking blingy glitters, with, the Columbine shooters. Like, but that's like, it's part of the genre. That's kind of unavoidable. Like I said, I mentioned Etsy earlier, but again, you can type in any serial killer and find posters and shirts and goofy coffee mugs and jewelry. And I don't understand, even in myself, the impulse to display that kind of stuff. But it's so, I mean, it's like all over the place.
Yeah, I think things have definitely taken a turn where they're like kids talking about, oh, this is a way of like, worshiping people being free of all that kind of stuff. I know I was kind of getting at that maybe being like a genuine motivation at times for some people. But if you are actively like saying that's why you're into something, I don't think that's true. I think that,
like a put on.
Yeah, exactly. You are, you're trying to make yourself more interesting. It kind of reminds me of like teenagers getting into like the Church of Satan or something like that. Like it's just really kind of corny and stuff like that. One thing I did want to mention, just to kind of drop a bombshell, I guess, is that it's always women interested in this sort of aspect of things. You never really see guys kind of, I mean, there aren't that many female serial killers and stuff like that. So maybe that's one element of it, but you don't really see like
caught.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe that's it. I will say that I do have an Eileen Warnos sticker on my laptop too. So just to,
I feel a great degree of sympathy for her, actually.
Well, and that's something else that I've thought about quite a bit is especially in relation to like these mass shooters, and how they're perceived. I think personally with serial killers is especially being interested in Dahmer specifically. There's a way that, or there's the idea that it couldn't have gone another way. Like this was inevitable considering how their psyche was developing and the urge just getting more and more intense. Whereas if you think about like a mass shooter, for example, like you kind of have the inherent idea that they made a bad choice and it could have gone another way.
Mm-hmm.
Like they should not have done that. That's a bad thing to do. And they didn't have to light up a school or whatever that it is that they did. Whereas with these serial killers, I tend to put them in a box in my head, at least, where this was like an inevitable thing in their development, which I don't necessarily know if that's true, but that's at least how I kind of categorize them.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good distinction to draw. And even within killers, I think there's a distinction. There are certain ones where the focus is on their childhood and their upbringing and what the warning signs were and that kind of thing. And then there's lots of others where, we love a nature versus nurture story. And we love trying to tease out that difference. That's, that's just kind of how it goes. But there's also, I mean, it's hard for me to, because I am a Westerner, I am part of this culture. It's hard for me to tease this other thing out, but this is so culturally determined too. Like nowhere, first of all, the concept of a serial killer is very new. It's only a few decades old. And even though there are people who we can retroactively go back and
identify,
right, Gilles de Rais and people like that, who we can be like, oh, they were serial killers. That's maybe not how they were thought of at the time, and they certainly weren't. It doesn't seem to have been as common as it is now. And I've mentioned this movie before on this podcast, actually, but Memories of Murder, the Korean movie. This is a fictionalized version of murders that did actually occur in South Korea in the 80s. And I think into maybe early 90s. And they were the first serial killer murders in Korea. And that's also something to think about. Is it just a matter of diagnostic criteria that now that we have like, the FBI profile idea, now all of a sudden we're seeing them? Or is it something that was a phenomenon that actually did not exist in this place? And now that there's enough interfacing with Western culture, it's like an imported behavior.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You know, I don't know. That's
No,
that's part
I've
of
never
why
really
that movie is
considered
good.
that, but yeah, I mean that's a fascinating thing too.
Yeah.
The fact that this is like a modern definition that we retroactively, slap people with.
Yeah.
And thinking about, I think it was Freud. I mean, I'm sure there's a number of people who have talked about it, but like this kind of violent crime being inherent to any society, like it's going to happen. And how much of that is based on, I don't know, this like the superfluousness of true crime and mimicking or modeling or something like that, and how much of this is actually just inherent to human nature.
There's an interesting thing to kind of look at there around whenever you have a society, it's organized around some sort of idea of these people have the right to, like, there's authorized violence, right? Like authorized use of force and that kind of thing. And we sort of like accept that because it establishes a sort of peace otherwise, right? So instead of having everyone just solve their own problems with like vigilante violence and stuff like that, we have like police and the justice system and all that kind of stuff. And when we don't like the way things are going, like, like right now, for example, we want to reform those systems or create new ones or adjust things in those terms. And it's to reestablish like an acceptable level of just like normality. And I don't know. I think there's something to be said about just looking at this sort of violence. Like it's maybe the real fascination is that it breaks from that normality. Like if it was done in some sort of way that was acceptable, like as a sort of like a status quo, it wouldn't take on that as much interest from people, like if somehow we had like a sanctioned serial killer, there's one guy that's allowed to do this, so if you have like you want to get killed, you go to him and he takes care of it. Maybe people wouldn't be so horrified,
For me, like serial killers, like the big names, is always interesting because it's just kind of violence for the sake of violence, right? There's no justification for it, if there is ever one. But yeah, there's no like reasoning behind it, and other than they're driven to do this and can't fight that impulse, right? And even just this isn't true of all true crime, of course, because you can watch something like Snapped and see women who kill their husbands, and maybe there's more of a justification than in the case of someone like Ted Bundy. I don't know, but it's like a puzzle. I mean, it's inherently fascinating because it makes no sense. There's no like line of logic that a serial killer is following necessarily. It's just some kind of inherent impulse.
Maybe it's something like maybe in some cases, it's the fact that they aren't the authorized violence person, like they aren't authorized to use violence, and that's what kind of like pushes them to want to do it, kind of a thing.
Well, when you were talking about the authorized violence agents, there are plenty of people who get involved in those roles so that they can have a shield for their actions. There are plenty of serial killers who were cops, and there are also people like the Iceman, Richard Kuklinski. Anyway, he was he was a contract killer for the mafia and stuff like that, where so again that still brings up the question of where is this coming from, because is it just that these people had the urge in them and they found a professional outlet that, or like a way to sublimate it, or if those roles had not existed, would they have done those things anyway? We don't know. It's weird.
Like I always think about this kind of stuff with the military because there's like American Sniper, I guess, in his telling of the story, Chris Kyle, he has that whole bit about New Orleans after Katrina, where he said that like he sets up and just started shooting looters, which is just a made up, I mean, it probably didn't happen, but like it was a very bizarre story about him basically headshotting looters for
and
to be
things like that did happen, even if it wasn't him who did it. That kind of thing did occur.
But to take that kind of credit and be like, It'd be like, yeah, that was the kind of thing I'm into. And then you read all these stories about like Iraq and people just basically saying, oh yeah, we just shot anything that moved because, or Vietnam before that kind of stuff. Like just people who obviously felt like they had complete license to do whatever they wanted. So,
yeah, I mean, you can see that with torture in the military too.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. You know, for torture's sake. What is that about?
Yeah.
Right. But that gets sticky too because, you know, a lot of those guys, not so much nowadays, but like back in like Vietnam and stuff, like boot camp was pretty much breaking you down. Like I know that's essentially the purpose of it, but I think it's kind of gotten a little bit more lax these days. I don't really know, so don't quote me on this, but you know, it just gets murky about like how much of this is purely coming from that individual and how much of it is like contextually sort of developed, like just being in a war situation. Like, you know, if you're in like a unit in Iraq or Afghanistan or something like that, and you're ambushed by these people and you kind of start to develop this hatred of them, and you just think of the other as like just being like this horde of enemies or whatever, like then the idea of just mowing people down and something
more amorphous, I guess.
Yeah, then you know, it's hard to say that person is motivated just from some like out of the blue want to do violence. Like it's clearly coming from the situation they're in, and it doesn't justify it, but I'm just saying
but it may
the
explain,
origin of it.
They're not necessarily have like this. They're not in the serial killer box in the same way, kind of thing.
Right.
So.
Like if they were a mailman, they maybe would not have those kind of desires and stuff. Although maybe that's not a good example. Going postal, you know.
I mean, that's kind of why I always found Jeffrey Dahmer so interesting. And we were talking about, you know, primary resources. There's so much with Dahmer, whether it's like interrogations or interviews he did while he was alive. And his father wrote a book that I think is out of print now, but I have a couple copies of because it's one of my favorites. It's called A Father's Story. And he goes, you know, all the way back before he was born. He talks about the early days of his marriage and, you know, conceiving Jeffrey Dahmer and what life was like for him from, you know, A to Z.
Oh. Oop. Sorry. That was my pet.
Well, I found something
of all the
here. I
people
guess he
to
was
drop
curious.
into this conversation.
So that was Ed Buck just dropping by.
I was like, oh, somebody's here.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the book is fascinating because it's the closest that I've found like you can come to sort of a very zoomed out look at a person's life and understanding why a person would do something like that. But again, it's like kind of solving a puzzle, and that's sort of why it's interesting. I don't know that there's ever a solution or like an answer or anything's ever neatly wrapped up with like a bow, but you kind of get closer to that.
Mm-hmm.
And also another just to really quickly touch on another reason I'm so interested in Dahmer specifically, but he actively hated that impulse in himself his entire life. And he kind of tried to like numb that with alcohol. He was famously like a hardcore alcoholic. And he did a lot of his murders in like blackouts and would wake up next to a butchered body and be like, fuck, did it again, Jeffrey. Like, you know?
Yeah.
But he hated it. And he, as much as me or anyone tries to understand it, like he was trying to understand himself too.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't ever, at least to my knowledge, come down like where Bundy came down and just like blamed porn or something.
Mm-hmm.
But he was basically like shrug, also don't know, like, and that's sort of how he even dying, he was like ready to die. He's like, I'm sick of this, I hate it. He to the end didn't understand why he was driven to do those things.
How many people did Dahmer kill? I don't know the details of a lot of these things.
It was 17.
Okay.
He had kind of a long run though.
Mm-hmm.
And he was one of those people, I mean, I don't know how much I'm just like kind of retroactively reading into this because, you know, the people who knew him obviously didn't think he had the capacity to do 17 murders. But there was a lot that led up to it, and you could see the buildup very clearly in his behavior and even in like the messiness of his crimes. It almost like you'd read his father's book and be like, oh, of course, right? That's the natural end point that anyone who lived his life would come to, which is a weird reaction.
Yeah, but that kind of brings up something that I wanted to talk about, which was whenever you have a story like this, it kind of automatically everything in that person's life is going to fit into this narrative of like eventually he becomes this person, and then all these things happen, and I think that's something that can really color the way that we understand this sort of stuff, because like what if there's hundreds of kids that have the same basic backstory, but they don't end up becoming Jeffrey Dahmer. They end up, maybe they don't end up in a good way, maybe things don't go well for them, but they don't end up serial killers. And without that, because we don't look at that, right? Like that's not highlighted. We don't really have that same kind of interest in those stories. It's hard to say like, oh, well, this is clearly like, you can see all the stages developing. Yeah, like it's so obvious in retrospect, but I mean, this is a problem just with any kind of like history in general. Like it's you can always say that it's so obvious how this led to this, and then that's why this thing happened. But when it's happening in real time, like in the present, you can't just assume that that's how it will play out. Like if you have a kid that's in the same kind of situation, you're not going to assume that that's what's going to happen, right?
No, of course not.
That's kind of also like when Donald was talking about like the people who were in like state-run mental health and having been hospitalized and stuff like that, and kind of the weird rhetorical extremes of everyone who commits a crime needs to suffer for it, versus the people who are like, there's no guarantee that anyone who's mentally ill could do violence, but then some of those people doing violence. There's also tons of people who are slipping through the cracks who probably have the same pre-existing mental state and just have not done anything ever, so there's no reason that they would be in that system in the first place. So your sample size is biased anyway.
That was something I was thinking about this morning, just to briefly like touch on your point. Like I've, like many people, been in very dark mental places and had like very bad depressive episodes where my life just goes to shit because I can't function. But I never felt like I was on the cusp of murdering someone. But even just like dialing it back a little and thinking about how I still function, like I'm, I hold a job and I have close friends and, I might be in a relationship, but thinking about how many people who aren't, dealing with this in any clinical way and just doing their, going through their day kind of like chugging along without any, oversight.
Alana, do you remember I think this was an episode of Sword and Scale. There was a guy who was maybe like a neurologist or something like that, and he was developing some sort of criteria to, I don't know, maybe it was like to check for psychopathy or sociopathy or something like that. And then he noticed that like the chart on top of the pile was actually his.
Oh, yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know the specific story, but I think that, I mean, the idea of that, I think, has like gotten picked up elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah. But he was just someone who, like Tom was talking about, the predilection was there. He just hadn't, in his own explanation, it was that he had like a loving, stable childhood, so there was never any reason for
trigger
him
or something.
Exactly, to start acting out in socially inappropriate ways.
Well, sure, even just about like sociopathy as it's studied. I mean, you kind of have two ways you go. Famously, something terrible happens, or you inflict, pain on others, or you become like a Jeff Bezos, right? And you completely use that unfeeling kind of part of your personality to your advantage. So it's like two ends of a similar spectrum, but just a matter of, it goes back to that nature versus nurture thing.
Right.
Yeah. There was one last thing I wanted to kind of bring up to discuss, which was the level of sympathy that any particular case can generate, which I think is kind of interesting. Obviously, many times you feel sympathy for the victims and the victims' families and the communities and stuff like that. But sometimes it's the perpetrator of these crimes themselves that elicits some kind of sympathy in some way. Like when we were talking about the guy who on the Greyhound who had some mental illness that caused him to do this stuff and then was perfectly fine otherwise. Obviously you feel bad for him on some level, right? Like whether I don't know, people are going to respond to that differently, but on some level you have to feel sorry for him that he had to do that.
Sure.
But even in a case like Jeffrey Dahmer or something where someone has like a really bad childhood and stuff like that, there's some element of like, oh, well, without even trying to justify the actions and everything that takes place later, you feel bad for them, or you just having grown up in a certain kind of way that it's almost like they didn't have a chance.
Yeah.
But then sometimes
Warnos is another example of that.
Yeah, for sure. Warnos.
But then there's also other times where people in some kind of weird way, like they feel some sort of sympathy with the person as a murderer or whatever the crime is, and I don't know. I think it's just like an interesting phenomena because sometimes it will be, I don't know, it reflects different like cultural things that are going on. Like if it's some kind of,
that's also true.
One thing that I've noticed when people are talking about this is the idea of, we kind of started this with the idea that like women in particular have this like particular fascination with true crime and stuff. And I think this is kind of a goofy idea, but there are people that talk about the idea that women are interested in it because they're more like vulnerable to this kind of violence and stuff like that. So it's like more fascinating to them. And I don't know about that because I just don't, I don't know. That doesn't really make a lot of sense.
You're saying like the argument being that like we're more susceptible to being victims?
Yes. And so therefore it's like some kind of like self-defense sort of a thing. Like
I've heard that explanation, like, brought up in the past, but I'm like you, I don't really understand it. At least I don't identify that in myself. But again, none of this makes sense to me. So it's hard to say. I don't know if I'm the best, like, I don't know if I'm doing the best self-analysis, but I don't see that in myself, at least.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't feel correct to me that that's what's going on with it. And I think that idea that there's some sort of element of, I'm learning about my enemy or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's some kind of connection there with the whole sympathy angle, where especially when people are feeling sympathy for the murderers as murderers, like they like if someone kills a bunch of women or something like that, and it's like Elliot Rodger, that kind of a thing. And, most of the people who are like pro Elliot Rodger are doing it to like be a troll and all that kind of stuff. Like, I don't think it's like a genuine thing. But then there are people who, read his manifesto and can like identify with some of the stuff that he was feeling or saying or whatever. And I think there is something to that on both sides. Like there is maybe some factor of women are interested in this because of, there's a greater threat to them from this kind of stuff. But it just doesn't seem like as the key component, even with the whole like sympathy angle,
Well, I'm not going to come down on either side of that, definitively. But it's funny that you reminded me of a single person when you were talking about this. One of my friend's moms, she experienced a lot of abuse and sexual violence at a young age, and so she raised her daughter, my friend, to be very suspicious and vigilant and terrified, frankly, of men, to keep them at arm's distance all the time. So in that sort of a situation, I think there may be something to that of like, being interested in true crime as a way of like educating yourself about the enemy or something like that. But she also the mom is very obsessed with that Snapped show.
Yeah.
where women are, finally getting to the way that it's framed, obviously, is they come to a point where they kill their husband or their partner or whatever. And that goes in the other thing that you were talking about, where it's like then the sympathy is for the criminal and not for the victims of the crime,
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it's
that's
just funny
interesting.
that that this was that both of those were encapsulated in one person in my mind.
Yeah, it's funny and it's illuminating and scary all at once when I think about, just on a personal level, why I kind of like engaging with this stuff. And I think a lot of it is because like, not just sympathy or empathy with the killer, but I'm hardly ever thinking of the victims. And maybe that's just by nature of how the story is told. But at the same time, I'm constantly identifying with the murderer and saying, holy shit, like, this resonates with me for some reason.
Right.
And it's almost it's like a scary and like exciting activity to realize that, like, you have that capacity.
Yeah.
And not just like to harp on the capacity for evil and yada yada, but like, you can not only see how they got there, but it's a little bit close to, like, you sort of identify and think like, whoa, what would it take for me to get there?
Yeah.
Right. And I noticed this in listening to Sword and Scale specifically. Like, there's this gesture towards, talking a lot about, or spending a lot of airtime on justice and the victims' families. But like, that shit is boring to me. And like, I'm not proud to say that, but just speaking honestly, like, I want to hear about the killer.
Yeah.
And I'm hardly ever thinking about the victims or the impact or anything like that. And that's, that further confuses me as to why I like this stuff.
When Tom was talking about, just this sympathy for the killer and stuff, it made me think of like a lot of the way that in the past few years and stuff, there was this sort of political valence for a lot of crimes that then, spun off into strange debates or, memes and stuff online. I was thinking of like Chris Dorner and some stuff like that where there's like a sliver of like political relevance kind of to it, and then that can kind of spin off into, celebrating it in some way or something, or, a lot of the overseas kind of stuff sort of blends into that, where you have people sort of focusing on different foreign policy stuff, cheering for either side of different conflicts and stuff, where they start to get into this weird way of like just, I don't know. I feel like it kind of blends in all this kind of stuff, like where you're showing that you're willing to sort of troll people by supporting the most absurd stuff, like being like pro Stalin and all this kind of stuff, And I think for a few years we were, at least I was down that road pretty far, kind of making
when you use Stalin as the example, I was like, coming from Donald? Really?
Yeah. So, and I don't know, it's strange to think of that kind of stuff. Like what? Yeah, like as you said, like I've never read like many books about like Stalin's crimes or whatever in detail, but I've read like his collected works or something like that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like it's like, I don't know. It's just it's a strange.
Yeah, well, I think it ties into just like the shock value nature of this kind of stuff too, and how that, for a majority of people who casually engage with true crime, this becomes like a personality marker that is bleeds into that shock value thing, right? So like thinking, just going back to the stickers on my laptop, even like how much of that is like, ooh, she's dark. She's got Ted Bundy on there. Like, I don't think that's not the case. Like, I'm definitely playing into that too.
Yeah.
As much as it actually fascinates me, and as much time as I spend thinking about these things, there's definitely that shock value part of it.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so let's get into the questions then. We'll start with this one. You have such a great cast of guests, especially Leo and John V. How do you end up meeting these people and then getting to know them well enough that they end up on the pod? Basically, how do you make friends on the internet?
That's nice. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad people enjoy our guests. They pretty much always are people that we've known for a while, sometimes like 10 plus years, like in the case of Leo, for example. And John too. John known.
Yeah, I was gonna say Donald, Tom, John and Leo all have something in common about where they met and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Do you guys find, just since, like, you know, Molly and I used to do a podcast, like, do you guys find that do they reach out to you to try and come on, or are they open to coming on? Like, because we've really never had anyone say no. I was always surprised by, even if I didn't really know a person, how willing they were to talk to us. Specifically us, but just in general.
I think I would say like 90% of the people that I ask are just immediately on board. And I don't know how many people have specifically requested to come on, at least for me. I think more people have asked Dawn about that. But not a huge amount. We pretty much just keep it to like our friend group and stuff, and kind of just do that kind of thing. And so, you know, it's kind of just like a little host of regulars that are coming on. There's a few people that I'm like constantly harassing about coming on, and they're just really shy about it. So I'm just like trying to slowly wear them down.
I mean, I get that, the shyness part of it, but I was always surprised just by how open and willing people were to come on. Even if, like, I didn't know them that well, they were just like, sure, whatever.
Yeah. I don't know. I think it's fun for people. I mean, I know if I was offered something like that, I'd probably be down to do it. So
yeah, people love talking.
Yeah.
You know, hearing their voice.
But just to go back to the question, you know, they're asking, how do we find these people? I don't know. We've just been on the internet for a long time. You just kind of get to know people, you know?
I think you need to it's just common interest kind of stuff, or like following the same news stories. And then I always say to people that like get into DMs with a group of people that care about the same things that you do, so that they will trash talk stuff all day with you. Like that's kind of that's kind of the goal, because then you kind of know them. Because honestly, there's probably like I follow a fair number of people online, but they still, a lot of them blur together in different ways, because it's hard to keep track of so many people, all the personalities and stuff, and it's better to just kind of try to make friends with a few people, and they'll make very clear very quickly who they don't like. So
yeah, that's a good point. There's no better bond than commiserating too.
Yeah, sure.
And actually, that was a topic of an early episode, making friends online.
That's right, which I think you were on, right?
I think so. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know if I listened to it or if I was on it. But anyway, link it in the description for this fellow, whoever asked this.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing is that our guests are interesting people in their own right and stuff, but I don't know that they are like some kind of like special group of people any more so than like other, you know, there's probably plenty of people who have like interesting friend groups that would make good podcasts. You know, it's just that we're doing it, and
so. That really is the distinction, you know.
Right.
It's not like a panel of experts. It's just friends.
Yeah. I mean, very rarely do we have anyone who knows what they're talking about on here.
Yeah.
Right. So speaking of people I'm always harassing, so someone here says, if you are in contact with Mousecrung, get him on the podcast. Yeah, I have been berating him in the DMs long enough. Like, we used to talk all the time in the DMs, and now he just ignores me because I always ask him to come on the podcast. So losing friendships left and right for you people. I hope you appreciate
True selflessness.
Yeah. All right. A lot of rightist discourse is predicated on stuff being gay. Pronouns are gay. Renewables are gay. Progressive income tax is gay, etc. Okay, maybe a generalized slur that stems from homophobia, but these are weird lacunae. Blacks aren't gay. Unions aren't gay, except maybe public sector unions. Islam isn't gay. So gay means something beyond thing I don't like. What could it possibly be?
I have thought about that a lot. I don't have an answer. No, I really have, because like in my mind, things that should just be, I think part of it is things that I think other people should ignore. Mm-hmm. Like things that it makes me annoyed that people are even paying attention to. I'll be like, and I kind of feel that way, like even like politically, like I'm like, why are people giving these like idiots the time of day? They're so fucking gay. And so I don't think that's the entire meaning, but that's at least part of it for me. And I have not come up with a sufficient explanation. Like and also part of it is like the old Louis C.K. joke, like of the difference between like gay and gay, you know. But I still don't know what that is. Do you guys have any ideas?
I mean,
no,
for me,
but
the
I get what you mean.
Yeah, the closest I can even, you know, as far as I understand it, like it means like corny to me. I guess.
Yeah, that's also part of it.
I don't know how that happened, but that's sort of what I think of when I hear it and used in that sense. It's just like, I don't know, something's corny.
Tiresome and annoying and stuff.
Yeah.
So. I am thinking about like in high school when it was just there wasn't any like kind of hubbub around like, is this an okay word to say? It was just a word that we
It's funny you mentioned it though, because I was having that exact thought like last week, because I remember constantly calling people faggots like all the time. And I was like young enough that is like appalling. But I also remember it being so commonplace that like I didn't even think about it. And I did not even really get scolded for like my mom would be like, "Oh, stop it." You know, but it wasn't like the appropriate level of like, you know, don't say that.
Yeah.
It's interesting how you know, when you use words like that in that way, it doesn't really register as like I'm referring to like homosexuals or something like that. Like that doesn't register at all. But it still like means something specific. Like if you call someone that, you say something's gay, you know, retarded, whatever. These words like there's some kind of like real meaning to them. It's not just like a general like this is just a negative word I'm using. So it's interesting to think about. I think the same whatever that meaning is for like the word gay is the same reason that it's prohibited by God. You know, it's God says it's homosexuality is wrong because it's gay, basically.
Okay.
There you go. It's an infallible argument.
Alana, just the fact that like when you were talking about how as a kid like it didn't even register as either wrong to say it or as like semantically related to homosexuality. It was like opposite for me. I remember as a kid, I never said that, and I knew why it was offensive. And I even remember, so embarrassing. As bad as I am now, like I was worse then. I remember in like 7th or 8th grade, someone who used to bully me, he would say gay a lot. And I remember like sitting him down once and like talking to him.
Trying to reach him. Yeah.
I succeeded also. Like he was like,
well,
the way I phrased it was just like, you know, imagine if like, you know, you have brown hair. Imagine, you know, this is a trait that you cannot help. And, you know, imagine if that became a slur and people were using it all the time. And you know, it's just something about you that was, you know, that was just part of you. And it became something so negative. And he was like, oh, I understand.
Yeah. Well,
you know what's pretty funny about that is that's pretty gay.
That's very true. So then I went through a phase later, like in my later teens, where that suddenly became like such a fun transgression for me to call everything gay. And I was obsessed with the word gaylord. I was calling people gaylords all the time, like really, really into this. And then I finally like evened out. Instead of being on one extreme or the other, I'm like right in the middle now. So I'm no longer gay. So that's my story. So Donald, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh, just that. So 3 years ago, I had to do like teacher training kind of stuff for when I was a teaching assistant, and they had like a sensitivity person kind of come in and like, you know, do the human rights stuff. And one of the things that they did, they were like, we had like situations that you had to kind of walk through to kind of know what people did wrong and what they should do better.
Right.
And one of them was it says someone starts discussing homosexuality in class. And I was kind of like confused because I was like, wait a minute, like that's normal now or whatever. You know what I mean? Like it's not. And they were like, no. Calling it homosexuality is like a deprecated medical term. No one calls it that anymore. And I was like, oh, I guess I am, you know, like it's strange how like.
Still learning.
I don't know. Like I thought, I don't know. It's funny because I feel bad in some ways for like old people like having to catch up in some ways. I don't know, like just follow along. So yeah. Anyways.
But then you hit a certain age and you can be as racist and awful as you want. Because they're just like, oh, they have dementia. It's whatever.
Yeah, sure.
But that's also like, I don't know, that's a symptom of just gatekeeping to me, which is also a very negative behavior that I don't like to entertain in anyone. Where it's just like, why do you have to keep moving the goalposts? It's just to keep people on their toes and
narrow.
Yeah, and be like, oh, now you're a bad person. Now you're a bad person. Why do you have to do that constantly? Like where there's no actual virtue or harm in the language itself. You just have to keep making people dance around things. I mean, that's not to say that I don't understand why the term homosexuality as like an antiquated sort of like negative DSM,
like a fiction,
sort of thing. Like I understand the objection to that, but then to say that everyone who says the word homosexual when they mean like a gay person or a queer person or something like that is now like public enemy number one. Ridiculous. Very silly behavior. Don't like that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I just did that. I didn't know that was.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
Whatever. Who cares? Anyway, all right. So I don't know if we got around to resolving that, but okay, so we'll finish with this one. According to the Islamic faith, animals live in accordance with God's law by default. Yet Coco the gorilla was quoted by her handlers as claiming her tiny pet kitten Yet Coco the gorilla was quoted by her handlers as claiming her tiny pet kitten had ripped a sink out of the wall. Clearly this is a lie, and as such it's not permitted by the Quranic faith. Does this imply gorillas need to recite the Shahada in order to become Muslim, or is it instead a powerful debunking of the animal sign language myth? Oh, so I thought this was mistyped, but that sounds right. Like the gorilla claimed through sign language that this is what had happened.
Yes, that's correct.
I see. Okay.
I think that doesn't show anything about our laws. There are laws meant for humans, and there are laws meant for every kind of creature.
That's right.
And just because there's a law that says humans, you should not lie, other species that are capable of dissembling and deceit, we don't know what their Sharia is. So I don't think we can say anything definitively about that.
Right. Just like there's certain dietary regulations for humans, obviously that can't apply to every other animal.
Right.
And in the same way that animals are considered to be Muslim in that they are submitted to God's will in like a perfect kind of way, like they just don't have the ability even to deviate from it. You can say the same thing about inanimate objects, stars and rocks and water and, all that kind of stuff. Like there's just humanity and jinn that are able to kind of break from that. So yeah, that's our answer for that.
I don't think that gorillas can talk. I think that's probably I think they're probably just, they might have like maybe few broad concepts or something, but I don't think they could lie or anything like that. No, I think I agree with the second part of it, that it's just it's contrived. I don't know. It's like dolphins and all that. No, that's all made up. Yeah.
No. Can't be.
Yeah.
I got Tabs this book, I think last Christmas. That was
this past Christmas, yeah.
Yeah, that was it's about like the inner lives of animals and kind of like the most recent understanding of that.
Oh, that's cool.
It talks about like different animals and things like that. That's really interesting to me. I think the basic argument of the book is that the inner lives of animals are much more similar and expansive, like similar to our own and more expansive than people generally think. And I don't know, I think that's really cool. It sort of jives with like just how I feel about animals. Like I want them to be that way. So there's a little bit of that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter what I think. So I'm going to just believe the thing that I like. So.
Cool.
All right. Yeah. So let's wrap it up there. That was a fun episode. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Yeah. Thank you so much for thinking of me. That was fun.
Thanks.
Yeah. We should have you on again soon.
Yes, please. Anytime.
Cool. Okay, guys. So if you enjoyed this episode of You Can't Win and you'd like a second one every week, you can subscribe to our Patreon and you'll get that, as well as access to our Discord where you can chat with us and our lovely community. If you want to submit an anonymous question for us to answer on the public episode, you can do that by sending it to the Curious Cat, which is pinned to the podcast Twitter account. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.